everyone, I'm Captain Logan. Welcome back to The Bunker. Today I'm going to tell you how I felt about Signs, which was requested by Cody Barron. And thanks a bunch to you, and also for finally getting a hold of me and letting me know that you were the one that requested this movie, because I lost my request list at one point and put my feelers out and had everybody come back and let me know who requested what. And I knew I had Signs. I remembered that, but I didn't know who asked for it. And finally, Cody reached out to me, and I got his name, so I can credit him for requesting this movie. So thanks a bunch, Cody, and a really interesting choice on your part. I don't know if Cody knew that I had seen this movie once before and heard me talk about it and say that I didn't really care for it and wanted me to watch it again, or if he didn't know that I had seen it before and just wanted me to talk about it. But at any rate, this is one of only a couple of movies that I have now done a You Made Me Watch on that I had seen before, but it had been long enough now that it's interesting, for me anyway, to see what my perspective is like on it now. As I always say, you're never the same person day to day or moment to moment, and all of your different life experiences and things that you watch and read, of course, change your outlook on things and can give you a wildly different opinion on a thing than you had before. We've, of course, all experienced this in both ways, positive and negative. Sometimes you'll have something that you saw years ago that you really disliked, and then as you mature and grow as a person and get maybe even more well-read or well-watched in things, you'll discover that maybe there were prerequisites that you kind of needed to really appreciate that before. Maybe it didn't speak to you at one age, but will when you get older, or again, certain life experiences that you need. I'll say that I certainly appreciated Signs more because I'm a parent now, and there were and also some of my own experiences with faith and spirituality. This resonated with me more as an adult at 35 than it did when I saw this at 17 or 18 in the movie theater. So, like I said, sometimes that'll happen. With going negative, and sometimes it'll happen positive. So you might see something that you really dislike or that you really loved, and you just don't care for it now. You realize that it wasn't as good at some of the things that it was trying to do, because maybe you've seen some things now that handle that stuff better, or maybe you just look at life differently. So both directions, but I had the first one with this. I found myself appreciating this in a way I didn't back then, but still certainly having issues with it, and I don't know that they were the same issues I had with it back then. Honestly, it's been 18 years. I cannot remember what my beef was with this movie. I remember getting like halfway through it and in the theater and something turning me off, and I think it was something narratively, but I'm not sure, where I just went, oh, this isn't working, I'm not liking this, and then it never won me over. But I don't know what that is. It should have resonated with me more back then. I mean, I say that now that I'm a parent, I appreciate this more. With this guy played by Mel Gibson. His name is Father Hess, Graham Hess. He is having difficulties with his faith. He doesn't believe in God anymore, or isn't sure if he believes in God anymore, because a few months ago his wife got in a car accident and died, and her last words made him think that she was just having like neurons misfiring in her brain, and that it didn't actually mean anything when at first it kind of seemed like maybe it did, and he just had this shattering disillusionment about his faith, where he's starting to think that coincidences just happen, and nothing happens for a reason, and God's not really looking out for us, and it's all just, we go through our lives and do whatever, and nothing really means anything. And that's, I think, a pretty standard situation to make a person question their faith, but I bought it in this case. There are certain things in this movie that I think are a little bit cliche or stereotypical, but I didn't mind the setup for that, and I found Hess to be remarkably sympathetic. And like I said, I think I appreciated him more being a parent myself, and I won't get too personal here, but with some of my own experiences with the idea of faith and believing in God. And so those things maybe I needed some more years before I could really appreciate. But I'll tell you, the big thing that I don't remember thinking back then, maybe I did, that I had with this now is in relation to something that I grew up with that I love, that I've talked about on the channel before, and that is Field of Dreams. How did I not appreciate this, at least on the level of that? This movie has an uncanny number of things that connect it to Field of Dreams, and I suspect that that must have been an influence on this. I like that it's about very different things, but a lot of the trappings are the same, and a lot of the atmosphere is really similar. So it's almost, in some ways, like the opposite of Field of Dreams, where, like, in Field of Dreams, Ray is immediately confronted with the voice of God, basically, or the voice of the great beyond. If you build it, he will come. And right away knows that unless he's going crazy, there must be some other supernatural force in the universe that is compelling him to do something wild and crazy that will allow him to speak to ghosts in the afterlife, ghosts of old famous baseball players, Shoeless Joe, and those guys. And he right away knows that there must be an afterlife and that the supernatural is real. And in this, it's the opposite. It's about a man that thought that was true and has to go through the whole movie to find that. And then at the end, just like in Field of Dreams, it becomes very clear that those things must exist. So it's sort of like Field of Dreams backwards, but it takes place on a farm. It's got a cornfield. It's one of the main players in the movie is a failed baseball player, just like Shoeless Joe. It's kind of crazy just how much this has in common with that, and it has, in places, I think, a somewhat similar score. It's James Newton Howard. So not the same composer from Field of Dreams. Would have been interesting if James Horner, I think it was James Horner who did that score. I actually, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I'm right about that. But whoever scored Field of Dreams, it would have been interesting to hear them score this. But of course, for Shyamalan's first several movies, he had James Newton Howard. And they're not working together anymore, unfortunately. But so his scores tend to sound somewhat similar, but they're a little bit different for each movie. And this is maybe, in some places, more of kind of a hometown, more subtle score than he's done before, but still has some of those real kind of ominous overtones and real mysterious, a real mysterious sound. But anyway, I digress. I really enjoyed the Field of Dreamness of it all with this movie this time around, and I think probably the best thing about this movie is the performance from Mel Gibson. He's just spectacular in this. And I will say that the casting of Mel Gibson should have given away the ending, because Gibson is very famously a Christian, makes Christian films. Of course, Mel Gibson made Passion of the Christ right around this, just before, just after this, I think. And so the fact that he's playing a reverend in this movie should tell you, I mean, it doesn't necessarily give away the twist, but it should tell you that this guy at the end of this movie is absolutely going to refine his faith. And that's the internal conflict. That's the big question throughout this. Is and this is such a fun idea, sandwiching these two ideas together. Aliens and faith. And that's a question I think a lot of people, anybody that grew up in a church or was raised in a Judeo-Christian, or really any faith with a singular God, I guess, might be questioning, asking themselves as they grow up, well, if there are aliens, how does that fit in, If human beings are supposed to be God's chosen people, why would he have other people on other planets? Like, would the existence of aliens, and this is really what this movie is about, but I think it maybe kind of starts from this place for Shyamalan. If aliens really exist, does that somehow discount the existence of God? And so with this, we kind of flip that and turn it on its head, and an experience with extraterrestrials is what brings this guy to realize that there must be a God, and he must have been right about that all along, and allow him to, have faith again and to be the role model for his family that he needs to be. Right away, it seems like kind of the gimmick for this movie, or the cool kind of POV, is it's gonna be a alien invasion scenario, which in the background is grand scale, but we're gonna focus on this one family in this farm and see what their takeaway from all of that is and what their experiences are. And it's sort of like, a lot of zombie things, stuff like Walking Dead, where there's all these things happening to all these different people, and there might be a lot of different cool individual stories, but instead of doing it like Independence Day, where you focus on the people who are in charge and most have a chance at solving everything, or even instead of doing vignettes where you're following a lot of different people and looking at their perspectives, you have one small ensemble cast that are all in the same place, and you're looking at it from one singular perspective. So this is the Midwestern farmer's perspective. And that's what it feels like through most of the movie, until you get to the end and you realize that it kind of is all about Hess. It's all about Mel Gibson's character. And I find myself kind of wondering at the end, and I'll get to the predestination stuff in a little bit, did the entire alien invasion happen just so that this guy can have a chance at finding his faith again? But at least through 2/3 of the movie, it feels like what you're looking at is just one small town perspective on all of this. So it's a real minimalistic movie. It's not in a lot of different locations. It's not broad scale. Nothing happens in a big city. You don't see alien ships landing. You don't see aliens attacking people, except for in a couple of very brief, small moments and ways. There's not ray guns. There's no space battles. There's none of that stuff. It is a thriller before it's a sci-fi epic, of course, and it plays kind of like a rural horror film. And Shyamalan falls into the horror category and was considered that a lot more in the early 2000s than I really think about him now. Yeah, it falls in the horror category, but this isn't really a scary movie so much as a moody film and a movie with a lot of atmosphere. It's not about jump scares. It's not about it's not a slasher thing. It's not about picking off characters as the thing goes. It's not about any blood and gore or anything. And I know there's different kinds of horror, and there's minimalistic horror, but a lot of this is a lot more about kind of a character study than it is about freaking out the audience. And there's a lot of suspenseful shots and stuff in this movie, and there is downtime certainly, but it's also a very talky movie, which I really appreciate it for. It's a family drama as much as it's a horror film, I guess is what I'm getting at. So I guess the reasons that I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I did before are because I kind of, like I said, picked up on more of the rural farm stuff, the small hometown stuff, and the Field of Dreams of it all. It is a little bit stereotypical in certain places, of course, both as a rural Midwestern story and also as a horror movie. So some of the characterization, and I like all of these people, and a lot of it rings true, but there are certain things, like I guess just initial situations, that it has to work to win me over on, because they seem like kind of the obvious choices. You've got the ex-ball player who sees himself as a screw-up, who never really had a chance at the major leagues because he had this horrible strikeout record. So he's really good at home runs, but he always swings. He never tries for a ball. And I thought that seemed like maybe a little bit of too obvious of a way to go. Let's see, small Midwestern town. What's a kind of obvious standard career to go for? Baseball, because it's wholesome and it's American pastime. So we'll go with baseball. That kind of thing. And so some of those things were a little bit too stereotypical and easy for me. And then on the horror side, you have things like you've got a little girl, his daughter. Her name is Bo, who is kind of precog. She gets premonitions when she dreams, and she dreams of her brother dying. And so when we get to that scene, we're able to stop what we thought might be predestination from happening. Not necessarily because we know that that's going to happen, so we're able to prevent it, but just there's supposed to be some anticipation and tension from the audience in waiting for that scene to happen. And then when we get there, it kind of doesn't really matter that the little girl saw it coming. Nobody's prepared for it or anything. She just goes, I saw this in my dream. And I guess the point of it is just to say that we do have free will and that people do have choices that can lead them past what seemed to be fated. Or maybe even that, I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is all about like signs that God gives us. So maybe there's a reverse psychology thing there. Maybe God puts like thoughts or dreams in people's heads to make them think that one thing is going to happen, so that they can be encouraged by the fact that that didn't happen and feel like they were able to change something. I don't really know. I just think that part of the story is really unnecessary and really cliche. So many horror movies have the kind of spooky little girl. She's not creepy or anything really, but you got like the soft-spoken, like a telepath or a girl with premonitions, girl who has dreams like this, sort of the poltergeist thing in so many horror movies, and I would have excised that from this. I don't think that was really necessary. So there's some cliche stuff here and there. But like I said, I enjoyed this a great deal for atmosphere. It's shot in just beautifully, just incredibly well, like Shyamalan tends to do. Some people, I think, find his stuff a little bit too gimmicky and a little bit too, kind of college experimental, but it's so different from a lot of other directors, and obviously he's been really influential, and there are more people who shoot like him now, but it just seems like he's always thinking about where the camera is. It's very much that kind of John Carpenter thing. And I appreciate his directing style for that a lot. There are times where it seems a little bit too artsy-fartsy. I always talk about that scene from Unbreakable on the train between the seats, where I'm like, I don't really know why we necessarily had to get that from like a kid's perspective behind seats or whoever was supposed to be back there. If there was even anybody back there, I can't remember now. But there's things like that, and there's some shots like that in this movie. There's one shot toward the end where we're supposed to be in suspense and wondering if the kid with asthma, what is his name, Morgan, is going to make it or not. He's got asthma attacks, and he's been attacked by an alien, and is he going to survive? And we're not looking at him at all. We're just looking at his family, and we're kind of panning around the room at everybody, not shaky cam, but a little bit haphazard, because it's a real tense moment, and everybody's freaking out, hoping that he'll make it. And then you start hearing him talk for a good 10-15 seconds or more before we actually pan down and start looking at him. And I thought that was kind of an odd choice, where it's like we're hearing him. Maybe the idea was supposed to be that like the audience is hearing him, but the rest of the family hadn't yet, and once we get to him, now they are. Maybe that was the idea. But I don't know, in the moment, I just thought it was an odd choice to hear him talking, but then treat it almost like a reveal when we get down to him. Oh, now he's alive. Well, yeah, I've been listening to him talk for 10 seconds. So there's some things like that are kind of odd. But for the most part, he does a wonderful job of building suspense and making things wonderfully tense and gripping with his camera placement, particularly with some of the pan shots, but also just moving really slowly forward and fixating on one object until we finally get to it and kind of figure out the significance of it. I like all of that. I like the lighting in this movie a lot, especially outside on the farm. And like I said, performances. I guess I started talking about this earlier, and then I kind of ran away with myself with the spirituality of it all. But Gibson is really believable and likable and sympathetic in this movie. He gives a really intense and authentic performance. I liked him as well here as I have in anything. I believed him a lot in this role, and he seemed like a reverend to me. He seemed like a guy who might have actually grown up in a small town, and I was just really impressed and taken in by his performance. And it's wonderfully layered, because this is a difficult role to play. He's not just playing a reverend, but he's playing a guy who had faith and then only 6 months ago has lost it. So he has to play the cynic who used to be the eternal optimist. That's really difficult to do. There's this inherent contradiction there, where you have to look like a guy who has always been really good at helping people feel better about themselves and giving them comfort. That's talked about a lot in this movie with his brother, Joaquin Phoenix's character. I rely on you to get comfort. I look up to you. I want to be like you. There's a real nice tear-jerky scene toward the end where he says that. But it's not just that I look up to you and I want to be like you, but you're who I go to get confidence, to feel like things matter. And so when that guy loses his faith, it's very difficult for everybody else around him to retain theirs, because he's their foundation, he's their rock. And so he's got to play a guy who still has those sensibilities at his core, but is pushing against them and doesn't think that he is that anymore. But deep down, he still is that guy. So I like that scene toward the beginning where they chase the alien on the roof, and they think that he's just some guy, some neighbor messing with them, and then it turns out that they're dealing with an alien. And Joaquin Phoenix's brother, Meryl, he wants to go outside and like spook the guy and get him off the roof. And so he says, let's run outside and scream at him and curse and stuff. And Hess is like, yeah, I don't like cursing. It's not natural for me when I say it. I thought that was funny. And then he goes out and he says some really silly, stupid things, trying not to swear. And then finally he just lets out like a real minor swear, and he goes, I swore. And that whole thing is really funny. There's some nice and kind of rings true. There's some nice bits of levity in this movie that I didn't expect. Certain moments that are just real, almost like awkward small town humor, which comes from the way that people interact with each other in a small town where everybody knows each other and everybody knows your name, that you wouldn't get in another setting. And I think Shyamalan does do a really good job of capturing what that's like, where you have the sheriff who takes 2 hours to finally get to the farm to investigate this alien situation before we know that the aliens are everywhere and they've landed because of all the crop circles that all show up at the same time, and then now there's spaceships everywhere. Where she's dealing with some like really super minor thing down the road and shows up and just won't stop talking about it, and everybody's eyes are kind of glazed over, and all of that seemed really authentic to me. By the way, the sheriff is played by an actress I like a lot. I was trying to place her through like half this movie, and finally I just broke down and looked it up, and I was like, that's who that is. She was a little older in the thing that I'm most familiar with her for, and so I didn't place her right away. Her name is Cherry Jones, that's what it is, and she plays the female president in 24 in season 7 and 8, and she's spectacular in that. And I remember watching that show wishing that, I like Kate Mulgrew fine, but I feel like she would have been the perfect Captain Janeway. And that show was at that point partially showrun by Brandon Braga, who was one of the major producers on Voyager and a lot of the Star Trek shows in the 90s. And I remember thinking through that, because he was writing a lot of Janeway-esque dialogue for her. Oh man, she should have played Janeway. So she's in this as the sheriff, and she has a lot of funny moments and some really nice moments of drama, particularly in the flashbacks where she has to let this guy know that his wife has died. And so I really enjoyed seeing her in this. So the idea with this is, and now I want to get into some of the predestination issues, is that this guy has lost his faith because his wife died in a car accident 6 months ago. And it was just a freak accident. Like, nobody is really to blame for anything, terrible they were doing. Nobody was irresponsible. It was just a guy who fell asleep at the wheel. And, by the way, I like that the guy who accidentally kills Hess's wife is played by Shyamalan himself. I think that's really fun, because Shyamalan, as a writer, narratively chooses to give this guy a tragic backstory by killing his wife. And then he, in the universe, plays the man who accidentally kills his wife. I think that's great. And he turns in a pretty good performance in the scene where he's telling Hess that aliens apparently are allergic to water, and so he's going to go where water is. And also, by the way, I'm really sorry for hurting or for accidentally killing your wife. And so anyway, he's lost his faith now because he believes that the death of his wife proves that God has no grand plan, or that things don't really happen for any kind of a reason, that everything is just coincidences. It's just a series of random happenstance, and when you die, that's it. And he starts to believe those two things because there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to his wife's death, but more importantly, her last words seem to be nonsense. And I guess he expected that these last words she said that seemed kind of cryptic would mean something. And the more he thought about them, the more he decided that they didn't. And she says a couple of things, but the major thing is swing away. Which he takes to be a memory about one of his kids that had something to do with a swing set, I think. I can't remember exactly what. And it turns out, by the end, that swing away is actually related to the way that he can help his family survive in dealing with the aliens. So in her final moments, she apparently actually saw the future, or some version of the future, or had an image put in her mind by God to give her exactly the words that she needed so that he could save his family at the end. So the idea toward the end is that things really do happen for a reason, apparently, and that, yes, she had to die, and that's sad, but if she hadn't told him what she tells him, then maybe his whole family would have died because of this alien invasion, when an alien gets trapped in, or is on his farm and wants revenge because he accidentally sliced off the alien's fingers. I'm kind of all over the place right now, but that's a scene that really kind of irked me a little bit. You get to the end and you see that the alien that's after them is the one that in Shyamalan's character's house, he's like in a pantry, and Hess goes in there, and he accidentally slices the alien's fingers off. And then when you get to that big climax, Shyamalan feels the need in editing to remind you that happened and go back and show you a bit of the scene where the fingers get cut off, and he's already done a close-up of the missing fingers. But he holds your hand and feels like maybe you won't remember that happened. This is a pretty simple story, and to its credit, it's pretty tightly woven, and there's a lot of setup and payoff. There's some eye-rolly setup and payoff toward the end, in my opinion, that I'll talk about in a second. But do we really need to flash back to that? I know I complain about flashbacks a lot, but yeah, I got it. He's got his fingers cut off. He's the one alien we've seen. We know what's happening. I'm not an idiot, Shyamalan. But anyway, so Hess thinks that it's just, he tells his brother it was just neurons firing, that she just had this random memory, and that when she died, and that proves, science over faith and predestination and anything celestial, that it didn't really mean anything. It was just a random thing that her brain did. And because of that, she probably didn't go to any kind of an afterlife. She's probably not in heaven. She's probably not anywhere. And you can look at things in one of two ways, he tells his brother, who is just looking for, again, comfort. Hess tells his brother, you can either look at things as happenstance, and nothing happens for a reason, and things just happen. Or you can assume that there is somebody watching out for you, and live your life that way. And his brother says, well, which are you now? And he says, well, I know that you're the first thing, the second thing, that you believe in a greater power, so what does it matter what I think? Which, of course, immediately tells his brother that he no longer believes, and it immediately ruins that sense of comfort that he feels. And throughout the movie, there are signs, most of them right at the end, or at least that he would finally realize that these things were signs from God, that he really is there and he is really looking out for people. And that maybe, this is my interpretation of it, we do have free will, and God's not just moving people around like they're on a chessboard, but he is nudging us in the directions that that he thinks we should go, that would make us the happiest as we can possibly be, while not ruining free will. That's kind of what it watches like. Hess is a little bit too black and white, I think, with the idea. I mean, I would just think that in his faith life before, he would have had maybe enough common sense. Maybe I'm bringing too much of my own bias to this, but that he would have enough common sense to realize that if there is indeed a God, it has to be something in between that, right? Surely not everything is a part of God's plan, and that there are some things that just happen by coincidence, even if you do believe in God, and that it's not all or nothing. It's not it's all coincidence or none of it is, because after all, if it is the case that everything happens for a reason, everything, and it's all God's reason, then wouldn't that negate free will? What is the point of making any decisions yourself at all? Why not just kind of sit in your room and wait to die? Every good and bad thing that's going to happen to you, it's going to happen to you because you don't have any choice in the matter whatsoever. It sure doesn't feel like the world that we live in. Now, I know that not everybody is going to agree with me on that, and again, so I'm kind of bringing some of my own bias to it. But this guy just seems pretty reasonable and down to earth to me. He doesn't seem super ethereal. He doesn't read like he goes through his life, saying things like, and then God, brought me to this place, and God brought me to this place. Like, no, he makes decisions, and then there are actions and consequences, and those things happen because of choices he made, but God maybe helps a little, or God, helps to give him the confidence he needs in order to do those things. So again, I'm bringing some of my own bias to this maybe, but also that's the sort of character that this guy seems to be. So I will criticize Shyamalan a little bit for making him as all or nothing as he kind of seems to be. The signs idea is kind of clever. He starts with this basic premise, kind of like he did with Unbreakable. Here's the thing that happens in real life. I'm going to come up with some kind of fun fictional explanation for it in my movie. If this was really, if this was actually real, if this was really happening, what kind of real-world explanation can I come up with for it? And the thing about Shyamalan is his movies are pretty heightened. I feel like he kind of sits, this is going to sound like a real slight on Shyamalan, I feel like he sits somewhere between, as a writer, and especially a horror writer, or a Twilight Zone-esque writer, somewhere between, like, Stephen King and R.L. Stine. He's closer to the Stephen King side than he is R.L. Stine. His characters ring more true to me. They seem more like real people. I get invested in them. They're not entirely cliches. But he does sometimes fall into that cliche trap that R.L. Stine always falls into, with at least, Goosebumps and Fear Street and stuff that I've read. I've read a lot of Fear Street, but, what of that guy that I've read. But also, he likes the O. Henry endings like R.L. Stine does. He gets into kind of some gimmicky stuff like that, and then he's just really into the twist, the Twilight Zone of it all. And so I think he uses his heightened universe sometimes as a little bit of a crutch, where he tries to present things like this is more or less the real world. Shoots very artistically, so there's certainly a sense of style to what he's doing. But I think he kind of wants to dupe you with a lot of his movies. Split is like this too, so even more recently he's doing this. He wants to dupe you into thinking that what you're looking at is more or less a kind of the real world, or at least a really believable world. But he also recognizes that people think that he's making really heightened stuff, and so he will get a little bit juvenile in some of his like leaps in logic and stuff, and use that heightened world as a crutch, if that makes any sense at all. I think he's kind of having his cake and eating it too a little bit on that. I'm never totally sure just how realistic of a world Shyamalan thinks he's making. And he's never gotten completely out of a sort of like college writing mode, I think. But his dialogue in this movie is as good as I think it ever is, and his characters are as believable as they ever are. So anyway, the idea here is, how do we explain the crop circles? And the explanation is, of course, what a lot of conspiracy theorists think it is even today. Well, it's aliens, but the big spin on that is we're going to use those aliens to tell a character study, this smaller story about this one guy, and make it about him getting his faith back, which is a really clever idea, because one of the big questions that I think a lot of Christians and just religious people in general have had to have asked themselves is, if human beings are God's chosen people, if there are aliens, how do the aliens fit in? Like, why would they be out there? And do they somehow negate the possibility of God? Like, if there are aliens, does that disprove God? There's a lot of sci-fi stuff where once we find other life in the universe, that starts to dispel religion. I think Star Trek has this to some degree, where it's like, well, now that we know that there's all these different races out there, we can't be thinking as Earth-centric. Surely we don't have God the way we thought in the Bible, when, like, that starts to look a lot more like just explanations for things we can't explain, before it looks like history once you have a bunch of other life in the universe. And this movie isn't really about that, but it's kind of fun to take that and spin it and put it on its head. Instead of dispelling religion, this is going to help this guy reaffirm his faith. I think that's a really kind of cool and interesting notion, and I wonder how Shyamalan arrived to that. That crop circles was the way that he was going to tell a story about a man who was lacking in his faith, or had a shattering disillusionment about that. And so Signs becomes a double entendre title. It's about the crop circles in getting the ball rolling in the first place. That's our inciting incident. And they are a sign of aliens, and then the aliens, in a roundabout way, become a sign of God. And it's about all of these different signs that God really is there, and that things really do happen for a reason, and all Hess has to do is retain his faith and believe that the things really are happening for a reason. Now, like I said earlier, my big question, or one of my big questions, I have many, ends up being, so are the aliens just there to help this one guy? And it's kind of that same thing, again, somewhat backwards, that I had with Field of Dreams, where it's like, by the end of that movie, you have all of these people who, with no advertising or anything, somehow know that there's this baseball diamond where they can watch ghosts of old baseball players play baseball on this farm. And they all show up because, I guess, God sends them there, which is almost like taking free will out of the occasion entirely. And so it starts to get like really big at the end of this much smaller story, where it seems like the whole world coalesces just to reward this guy for doing the right thing and for having faith in the universe, if not God. That movie is somewhat more secular about it, I guess. But then with this, it really feels like it's the same kind of thing, where the whole world coalesces in order to teach this one guy a lesson. And both movies have kind of the same problem, where the supernatural is revealed and made very clear and has to be happening, and to more really than just this one guy in both instances, when before nobody was really sure about the supernatural. So why now? Just to teach this one guy a lesson. Now the status quo of the whole world is kind of different, and more so in Field of Dreams than in this, but it still has that a little bit. I don't know how anybody around Hess at the end doesn't believe that there must be a God and that he must have orchestrated a lot of these things to happen so that he could save his family. So I'll break this down for a minute. My biggest issue with this movie is that, like I said earlier, it should have been, I think, more subtle and more ambiguous. And it's asking too much for Shyamalan, for subtlety with Shyamalan. But I think the character study is stronger and the character arc is better if there's some ambiguity about this. Is it really much of a opportunity for change if the guy sees all of these really obvious examples? There absolutely must be an afterlife and must be God, and goes ahead and takes that opportunity for change. He would look like an idiot if he didn't, because it's just too clear. I think it would have been really nice if at the end of this movie I was still questioning things while he wasn't. This is a character that I buy not needing too much of a push before he gets back to the beliefs that he had before. And there are just too many examples of the supernatural in this movie. So there's that example I gave earlier about the girl Bo who is seeing premonitions in her sleep. Axe that entirely. We don't need two major supernatural things. I think it's enough that the wife seems to see the future when she dies in the past, and that seems like maybe a connection with God moment. Like in just that moment, in that transition between life and death, she gets words from God, and then delivers those words to her husband and then dies. That's the best possible moment for something supernatural like that to happen. And then far in the future, he's going to be able to use that. But this girl just getting premonitions in her sleep is just too much. We don't need both of those things, and then it just keeps going on. So again, setup and payoff is important, and I appreciate how tight this is and that everything comes together at the end. But it just makes it all too clear where there's no question at all. So you have the asthmatic kid who God seems to have maybe given asthma to just so that he won't die when the alien breathes on him at the end. He's got this kind of like toxic mist that comes out of him that would have killed the kid, but he's got asthma, and so everything happens for a reason. The little girl is kind of a germaphobe and has weird things with water, so every time she takes a drink of water, she decides she's got some problem with it. It tastes funny, it tastes old, it's got somebody else's germs in it, so she leaves glasses of water all over the house. And God apparently did that by design so that there would be water everywhere to take out the aliens at the end who are apprehensive, who are allergic to water. Water is like acidic to them. Really, like, did we need all of these different things? Like, when all of that is all connected, it's so obvious that he must have been right in his faith in the first place. And wouldn't it be more interesting if there was a little bit of ambiguity about it at the end? So that's my biggest issue with it. I also take issue with water as the choice for the weakness for the aliens, because we just did that in Unbreakable. His very last film before this had a superhero whose kryptonite is water. And now we have aliens whose kryptonite is water. He's trying to crib a lot from War of the Worlds, just like Independence Day did. Instead of a virus taking out the aliens, it's water. Presumably, I don't think the movie's ever clear about this, that I noticed, but presumably that's the reason the aliens leave at the end, is that they discover that they have this water aversion. Maybe their planet doesn't have water, and they have some other basis for their life form. It's the only thing I can figure, because if you knew you had that and you went to a planet that was 2/3 water, you'd think you'd turn right around and go back some other place. So they must not have known what water is. That's the only way this makes any sense at all. But did it have to be water again? That's weird. The other complaint I have about the aliens is that we see them a little bit too much. I think it's a lot more effective if they remain almost entirely in the background. I do really like that suspenseful moment where Joaquin Phoenix's character sees one of the aliens on TV and they pause on it. I think that's the only moment, like, that's relatively freaky, and I think it's a nice moment. I would have made that the only time you saw the aliens at all. The rest of the time, I would have kept them obscured. Even if the characters in the scene can see them, I would make it so that the audience couldn't. I saw a snippet of one review that said that Shyamalan's cinematography is great. The only problem is he doesn't leave anything to the imagination, and I kind of agree with that to some degree, at least with the aliens specifically. One thing I really appreciate about Shyamalan's horror movies is that they're kind of safe for families and for kids, and there's a message at the end. I don't know how exactly I feel about this one, mostly again just because I think it's too on the nose and it's too all or nothing. But it's about something. There is a character arc here. There is it's not just about the jump scares. It's not just a bunch of one-dimensional characters in order to see a bunch of scary stuff happen. And it's kind of a nice entry-level horror movie for a little kid. Like, I'm probably going to show this to Jason, my 10-year-old. I think he would appreciate this and maybe get something out of it. Or maybe he will feel the same way I did about it in high school, and he'll have to have kids himself first before he can really appreciate this. One of the strongest scenes, I think, is the one where Mel Gibson makes all of his family everything they want for dinner, like they're having a last meal or something, and then gets angry because his daughter and his son want to pray, and then they're upset with him because he they can't look up to him the way they used to because of the faith he used to have, and he just kind of freaks out on them and tells them to stop crying and you must enjoy this meal, and that's a really powerful scene. It hurt my feelings in the right way, and then I don't know, it's just really tender and touching when they start hugging at the end of that scene. Like, I think it earns it. There are places where stuff like that in some of his movies, the few I've seen, seem a little bit too sappy, and that was a moment that really won me over. I think it's because I was already really caring about and rooting for these characters, so that really works. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this, I think. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Sure appreciate it. Leave your comments. Let me know what you think about Signs. I am feeling it. I'll flip my sign. This is my sign. I'm feeling it. I have my big issue with the end of this, certainly, but I enjoyed it a lot, and I don't know really what my issue was with it in the first place. I don't think it was that ending, though. I think it was something in the middle. I don't know. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you guys. I will see you guys again next time, and if you would like to request something to be reviewed off the cuff like this, just me and you shooting the breeze about, or me talking at you about a movie that you've probably seen, you can become a $15 Patreon, or excuse me, patron at patreon.com/Geekvolution, and you can request a movie for You Made Me Watch, or you can request a comic for the Comic Vault. And in the meantime, it's Captain Logan, and I'll see you guys again next time.